Daily Words of God. Anyone who does not understand the purpose of God's work is one who opposes Him, and one who has come to understand the purpose of God's work, but still does not seek to satisfy God, is even more to be deemed an opponent of God. There are those who read the Bible in grand churches and recite it all day long, yet not one among them understands the purpose of God's work. Not one among them is able to know God. Still less can anyone among them accord with God's will. They are all worthless, vile people, each standing on high to lecture God. They willfully oppose God, even as they carry His banner. Claiming faith in God, still they eat the flesh and drink the blood of man. All such people are devils that devour the soul of man, head demons that deliberately get in the way of those trying to step onto the right path, and stumbling blocks impeding those who seek God. They may appear of sound constitution, but how are their followers to know that they are none other than antichrists who lead people to stand against God? How are their followers to know that they are living devils, dedicated to the devouring of human souls? Those who hold themselves in high esteem in God's presence are the most abject of men, while those who think themselves lowly are the most honored. And those who think they know the work of God, and who are, moreover, capable of proclaiming the work of God to others with great fanfare, even as they look directly at Him, these are the most ignorant of men. Such people are without the testimony of God, arrogant and full of conceit. Those who believe that they have too little knowledge of God, despite having actual experience and practical knowledge of Him, are those most beloved by Him. Only such people truly have testimony and are truly capable of being perfected by God. Those who do not understand the will of God are opponents of God. Those who understand the will of God and yet do not practice the truth are opponents of God. Those who eat and drink the words of God and yet go against the essence of God's words are opponents of God. Those who have notions about the incarnate God and moreover have a mind to engage in rebellion are opponents of God. Those who pass judgment on God are opponents of God. And whoever is unable to know God or to bear witness to Him is an opponent of God. So I urge you, if you really have faith that you can walk this path, then keep on following it. But if you are unable to refrain from opposing God, then you had best walk away before it is too late. Otherwise, the chances of things turning out badly for you run extremely high, because your nature is simply too corrupt. Of loyalty or obedience, or a heart that thirsts for righteousness and truth, or love for God, you have not one jot or iota. It may be said that your situation before God is an utter shambles. You cannot abide by what you ought to abide by, and are unable to say what ought to be said. What you ought to put into practice, you have failed to put into practice, and the function that you ought to fulfill, you have been unable to fulfill. You do not have the loyalty, conscience, obedience, or resolution that you ought. You have not endured the suffering that it behooves you to endure, and you do not have the faith that you ought. Quite simply, you are completely devoid of any merit. Are you not ashamed to go on living? Let me persuade you that you would be better off closing your eyes in eternal rest, thereby sparing God from worrying on your account and suffering for your sake. You believe in God, and yet do not know His will. You eat and drink the words of God, and yet are unable to keep to what God demands of man. You believe in God, and yet do not know Him. And you stay alive without a goal to strive for, without any values, without any meaning. You live as a human being, and yet have no conscience, integrity, or credibility in the slightest degree. Can you still call yourselves human beings? You believe in God and yet deceive Him. What is more, you take God's money and eat up the offerings that are made to Him, and yet, in the end, you still fail to show the slightest consideration for God's feelings or the faintest conscience toward Him. Not even the most trivial of God's demands can you meet. Can you still call yourselves human beings? Eating the food God provides you and breathing the oxygen He gives you, enjoying His grace, yet in the end, you do not have the slightest knowledge of God. On the contrary, you have become good-for-nothings that oppose God. Does that not make you a beast even lower than a dog? Among animals, are there any that are more malicious than you? Those pastors and elders who stand in the high pulpit teaching others are opponents of God and allies of Satan. Would not those of you who do not stand in the high pulpit teaching others be even greater opponents of God? Are you not, even more than they, in cahoots with Satan? Those who do not understand the purpose of God's work do not know how to accord with the will of God. Surely, it cannot be that those who do understand the purpose of His work would not know how to accord with God's will. The work of God is never in error. Rather, it is man's pursuit that is flawed. Are not those degenerates who willfully oppose God even more sinister and malevolent than those pastors and elders? Many are those who oppose God, but among them there are also many different ways in which they oppose God. As there are all manner of believers, so too are there all manner of those who oppose God, each unlike the other. Not a single one of those who fail to recognize clearly the purpose of God's work can be saved. Regardless of how man may have opposed God in the past, when man comes to understand the purpose of God's work and dedicates his efforts to satisfying God, God will wipe clean all of his former sins. As long as man seeks the truth and practices the truth, God will not keep in mind what he has done. Moreover, it is on the basis of man's practice of the truth that God justifies him. This is the righteousness of God. Before man has seen God or experienced His work, regardless of how man acts toward God, he does not keep it in mind. However, once man has seen God and experienced His work, all the deeds and actions of man will be entered by God into the annals. For man has seen God and lived amid His work. When man has truly seen what God has and is, when he has seen his supremacy, and when he has truly come to know the work of God, and furthermore, when the old disposition of man is changed, then man will have completely cast away his rebellious disposition that opposes God. It can be said that everyone has at some time opposed God, and everyone has at some time rebelled against God. However, if you willingly obey the incarnate God, and from this point satisfy God's heart with your loyalty, practice the truth that you ought, perform your duty as you ought, and keep the regulations that you ought, then you are one who is willing to cast away your rebelliousness to satisfy God, and one who can be perfected by God. Should you stubbornly refuse to see your errors and have no intention of repenting yourself, should you persist in your rebellious conduct without the least intention of cooperating with God and satisfying Him, then such an obstinate and incorrigible person as you will certainly be punished and will certainly never be one to be perfected by God. This being so, you are the enemy of God today, and tomorrow you will also be the enemy of God, and so too will you remain the enemy of God the day after. You will forever be an opponent of God and the enemy of God. In that case, how could God possibly let you off? It is in the nature of man to oppose God, but man must not seek out on purpose the secret of opposing God, just because changing his nature is an insurmountable task. If that were the case, then you had better walk away before it were too late, lest your chastisement in the future become more severe, and lest your brutish nature erupt and become ungovernable, until your fleshly body were terminated by God in the end. You believe in God to receive blessings, but if in the end only misfortune befell you, would not that be a shame? I urge you, you had better make another plan. Anything that you can do would be better than believing in God. Surely it cannot be that there is just this one path. Would you not go on surviving if you did not seek the truth? Why must you be at odds with God in this way?